Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of TFN Talks, Northern Freight Logistics. The broad brush heading of what we're here to discuss this afternoon is decarbonisation and innovation, which translates into quite concrete questions in a week when we're expecting to hear the results of the union review from Peter Hendy. It's a good question. It's a good time to find out what's actually happened in the 7 years since George Osborne talked about the Northern Powerhouse. My name's Nicholas Hellen. I work for the Sunday Times. I'm transport editor there. As I've already said to your panellists, I'd probably claim to be the most northern of the lot of you. I was brought up within walking distance of George Stephenson's cottage in Wylam. And for those of you who are, for whom that doesn't mean much, he's the guy who basically invented railways in Britain and actually very topically for today created a line from Liverpool to Manchester back in 1830. So back in those days, as we all know, the North was ahead. The premise of TFN is that there's some catching up to do. So that's what our panelists are going to tell us about today, starting with Stewart Swinburn, who's both a board member of the TFN, covers the northeast Lincolnshire area, which of course includes Britain's greatest container and other port, Immingham. So we'll start with Stewart and I'll introduce each one of you. I'll move on as we go through each person. We're going to have about 5 minutes from the different speakers each. Then we'll go into general discussions. There is a chat box for you to submit them, and I'll do my best to pick them up. And if not, I'm sure I'll get nudges from the organisers. So the floor is yours, Stuart.
Oh, thank you very much, Nicholas. It's nice to be here this afternoon. And obviously, my name is Stewart Swinburn. I'm a North East Lincolnshire Cabinet member for Highways and Transport. And so obviously my concerns are around about the freight and basically round about the future rail improvements. We do have Immingham is known to be the largest in import and export of goods, not largest in size as a port, but we are largest by means of import and export of goods. We still hold the tonnage record in Immingham, and which we're very, very proud of. So there's a lot of concern about, the actual rail improvements and how HS2, for instance, will impact on us. We need up to HS2 to talk about and release the capacity to be used for transport freight. So it's a big thing for us at the moment, and we're always looking at the decarbonisation side of things. Now we've been just announced just recently, the last few days, about Immingham and the Humber receiving the Freeport status. So obviously that is going to be a big concern for us. If we haven't got the infrastructure in place, then it needs to be looked at, and hoping that TFN will take on our concerns about making sure that the infrastructure is there for when we take on this massive role. Anything else you want on that at the moment, James, Nicholas? But I will come in on any other points that may be raised within that about the agri-foods and how our network at the moment is supporting, a lot of freight and transport from the south of the region back into that area. So big concerns for us at the moment, and we're hoping that things will actually come to fruition for us with all the plans that's been announced in the Chancellor's budget last week.
I think before I pass on to Maggie, it would just be helpful to know if there's any, you mentioned the Freeport status, but if you could just add a couple of words about what you think the most pressing concerns are there right now, because I do think that there's so many different wish lists around at the moment, whether it be the eastern leg of HS2, whether it be the whole 39 billion pounds of rail enhancement. Just be good if you could say one or two concrete things about what you're actually looking for, where the pressing issues are.
Well, obviously the Freeport status have been given to the whole of the Humber, not just Immingham, but it's the whole of the Humber, including Goole, Hull, Grimsby and Immingham. But one of the major opportunities that we need to have is to make sure that infrastructure is in place for us to, make every opportunity available to us throughout the Freeport status. And a lot of the things that we're talking about is with HS2 and to actually release the rail capacity that's needed for this area to make it work for all the ports that's going to be involved in the Freeport status. And we have got an opportunity there for less HGV traffic. if we get the HS2 situation right. And we also have the opportunity to use rail from the Humber ports, especially for the containers, which Immingham now is one of the largest container ports. Again, not in size, but in types of quantity, what we use for in the containers. So it's a capacity for growth and for all our free port status. So it's something that we're going to be looking into, and hope we can get the full support of TFN in our ambitions to get the infrastructure in place correctly.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move now to Maggie Simpson, who's Director General of the Rail Freight Group, which basically speaks, as the name suggests, for all of rail freight across the UK. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here today as always. So as Stewart's indicated, last week we saw the announcement of 8 free port zones across the country. 3 of those are directly in the Transport for the North area, Liverpool City region, Tees and Humber. And of the other 5, almost all of them have strong trade links to and from the north of England, serving importers and exporters across the region. And it's an indication of just how critical the north of England is for freight and logistics transportation. I looked it up that around a quarter of all UK households are in the north of England. That's a heck of a lot of consumers. If, like me, your online shopping habits have boomed in the last year, then you'll be looking for warehousing, on-time delivery, fleet-footed, quick and sustainable logistics to get those products to you. And that's before we add in the needs of businesses as well. So it's absolutely imperative that the north of England's got the right infrastructure for freight, and that it's got the right low carbon sustainable infrastructure for freight. And frankly, as Stewart's indicated, right now today, it just doesn't have that in the way that we need it. And it's frankly time it changed if we're going to unlock those government ambitions, whether that's for free port, rebalancing or economic growth. We know that using rail freight today is low carbon. It makes 76% to use the stat less carbon than using road freight today. And I know we're all chasing net zero 2050, but as a colleague reminded me the other day, a ton of carbon that you've saved today is 29 tons saved by 2050. We kind of got to get on with this now, not waiting for a miracle to happen in a decade or two's time. And that means we need to be pushing forward with modal shift today, and we need to be pushing forward today with short-term plans for decarbonising rail freight and indeed road freight and other parts of the transport infrastructure. Whilst this is going on, we've got members chasing growth. I mean, just some things that have been happening recently, the trial for Kraft Heinz on using rail freight to deliver into their factory. We've got a boom in construction materials coming out the peak quarries, busiest ever March. Last year, second busiest March coming up, busiest ever December. This is supporting HS2 construction at Birmingham, but it's supporting infrastructure across the country. We've got 775 metre, 3/4 of a kilometre, half a mile, if you want to use that, long trains running now into Manchester. To get you an idea of the scale, for southerners, it's the distance from Euston to King's Cross. For northerners, it's the distance from Manchester Piccadilly to Manchester Octave Road. That's how long one of those trains are. So those things are all happening despite the fact that the infrastructure isn't there. But what do we need to do then to support modal shift? First of all, we've got to sort out the Transpennine upgrade. We still don't have confirmation, despite the money going into that scheme, that there'll be capacity or capability for freight in there. We've been chasing this now for half a decade, and it's time we got those plans confirmed to get a pass for freight across the Pennines. Secondly, if we've got schemes which are taking obviously time to work through, can we rebalance how we use the network in the meantime? We all want to see passengers come back to rail. If they take their time coming back, can we use that capacity now to run a bit more freight? In the meantime, can we run that freight a bit more efficiently than we do? And then what about electrification? We don't have enough power supply on the East Coast Main Line for freight to run with electric traction, even though we could. We've got the locomotives to do it. We need to link into some of the ports that are close to, but not on the electrified network, with some infill electrification. And we need schemes like the Hope Valley upgrade to properly take account of freight in a way that they're not doing at the moment. And then, of course, looking further out, HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail need to be progressed and need to have the right answer for freight as well. So there's a huge opportunity out there, opportunity for rail to help decarbonisation. It's not the only part of that story. Huge opportunity to unlock free ports, to unlock the potential. And we can do that with the private sector investing and the right balance of capacity on the network. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Elizabeth de Jong, who has had quite a high presence recently because of Brexit, working representing the voice of Logistics UK. If I could just chuck in a plea there, which is, it'd be helpful if even in your opening address you could say something about the extent to which freight and imports have already moved directly to the north, bypassing the pinch points in the southeast. I wonder if that's been a factor at all, and if that gives us any pointers as to where the growth might be.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. I might come back on that a little later, because we've got some figures coming out from ONS at the end of the week, which will give us some more data. But clearly moving around and moving where we do freight happens all the time, depending on pinch points. And I also think that the huge testing programme at the Dover Strait, other ports will have been able to take advantage of that as well. So we have seen movement around. I might be later. But it's great to be able to discuss challenges and opportunities in the sector of decarbonisation and innovation as well today. So decarbonisation industry, a big challenge, but it's one our members are tackling head on. There's still, though, a need to identify the necessary steps to enable industry to achieve this as efficiently as possible. For the purposes of today's session, there's 3 areas linked to decarbonisation, which there may be an opportunity for us to look at in more detail later. The first is reducing carbon by reducing congestion. So congestion is one of the biggest contributors to pollution, whether it's caused by queuing traffic within our city centres or holds up on our major truck roads networks. By both improving existing infrastructure and investing in new infrastructure, we can reduce congestion, therefore reduce pollution. Logistics UK, as you'd expect, is very supportive of transport for the North Strategic Transport Plans over the 7 corridors, which focus on infrastructure improvements across all modes. But also our response to the Union Connectivity Review, we think is going to be out this week, highlighted the importance of within country infrastructure in helping bring the nations together, including Transpennine road and rail proposals there. The second, decarbonisation is important, modal shifts important to decarbonisation. Another way to reduce congestion is to have less trucks on the road. That's why modal shift is important. And we need to continue to insist that rail is made a viable alternative to road transport. Rail freight has the potential for strong growth. It's constrained by lack of capacity. High Speed 2, Northern Rail, Powerhouse Rail, Transpennine route upgrades and electrification, all vital for modal shift. And the third area for us, which is important and linked to decarbonisation, is rethinking our approach to larger vehicles. Big can be good. Larger mode of transport should not be demonised in our quest for low carbon transport. They are in fact key to it. So as well as moving large loads by train, it should be possible to allow larger or longer trailers to operate on our roads where they do not directly compete with rail. And this in turn would reduce the overall number of vehicles moving at any one time, again, reducing pollution. Our discussions about innovation are timely, as last week at Logistics UK we held the first meeting of our innovation group, which is an area for dialogue between industry, government and developers to help ensure that externally funded innovations are business case led rather than tech led. That was our concern. And there's many areas of innovation within freight and logistics, all sorts of very exciting opportunities with technology, but one we could discuss today was free ports. That is an area for opportunity for regional rejuvenation and to be innovative. We don't quite know what they are, and that is almost the innovative part of it as well. And obviously we've got Liverpool, Humber and Teesside. Second area for innovation, which is very important for our industry, is connected and autonomous vehicles. They're going to be part of the future. We can see elements of those already be adopted. However, it's so important that those are introduced by industry for industry, and there's a business case led argument that they're required. If not, the investment in them just could be lost as well. And finally, linking both innovation and decarbonisation, alternative fuels will be an innovation, and they're clearly needed by industry for decarbonisation. However, at the moment, there's confusion and uncertainty about which horse to back. Electricity is going to be the solution for lighter vehicles in the fleet, but there's a lot less certainty around what will replace diesel for the heavy fleet. And the longer we take to make these decisions, the more inefficient, costly and risky our path to zero will be.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to Lucy Hudson, who's Principal Policy Officer at TFN and gave me a fascinating crash course in all this last week. Over to you, Lucy, and then we'll fire all the difficult questions at you because you've got an amazing grasp of it all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So because I'm sort of following on from three really sort of detailed discussions, I'm going to describe what Transport for the North is doing in the space of firstly decarbonisation and then freight and logistics in terms of the strategies that we're working on. And then I've been ticking off a lot of things that I was going to say, but because they've already been covered by the panel, so that's really good. And hopefully it means I will be quieter sooner, which is good, and we can have time to go into the questions. So the first point to make is because we're focusing on the decarbonisation agenda, we have a decarbonisation strategy going to our board in March, and that is alongside the freight and logistics strategy that I'm working on as well. So they're two really big and key areas of work for TFN. Our role is to provide statutory advice to Secretary of State on the transport investments that are needed, and to do that we need very detailed analysis and strategic and an agreement across the North of that strategic direction that we need to take, and that's the sort of key role that the strategies we're developing will enable us to do and to deliver on behalf of the North. So then what's the freight and logistics strategy? It's going to be a vehicle to showcase the North's freight and logistics assets. It's going to show you where we need the investment, why we need the investment. We've done some very snazzy modelling on demand suppression, so where freight trains have to wait in sidings, where you could get 2 freight trains through in that gap. What does that mean for the network? And that's not really been done before. I know other colleagues now from other subnational transport bodies are also using that methodology that we've developed, which is really good and really strong. Network Rail like it because it's not been used in that way before. So that's a really good, strong sort of foundation by which we can make that argument for increased investment in especially the rail freight networks. So the strategy is not going to be all these new ideas. We've made sure that we've done a very careful and considered review of all the existing strategies that have been published by partners, by us, by Rail Freight Group, Logistics UK, other people and other authorities. We've looked at that and then said, right, okay, well, where have we identified the gaps? What were they? Are they still relevant? And does the modelling match up with that? So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not saying this is completely new. We're saying these things are still a problem and we need to deal with them. And that will then set out my kind of priorities for what we need to build business cases for, and then liaise with government and keep providing that strategic advice and using our voice on behalf of the North. So the 3 things that are kind of the big things within the strategy are modal shift, decarbonisation, and then we touch on free ports. And I think those things have definitely been covered by the panel. So I'm going to move swiftly on to make sure that to outline that we're going to use our strategy to make sure we inform that strategic advice. But then in future we will then do a more wide consultation to double check that what we're setting out is the answers that people agree with, and then it can begin that the strategy will begin to be socialised across the North and wider to make sure we can get those answers that the North needs, but also to benefit the rest of the UK economy too. So when you think somewhere like Felixstowe, one of the main routes from Felixstowe is all the way up to Manchester and Trafford Park. So you can see immediately that that's an important route. And then you consider priorities around Ely. If we get investment in Ely, then it also helps improve access into the North as well. So it's not just about the Northern networks, it's about the whole network as a whole. So I'm going to be quiet now and then hand back to Nicholas.
Thank you. Now, I'm a bit torn here because I'm keeping a beady old eye on the questions being put through, and some are incredibly specific. So if you just indulge me for a minute, what I'd love to have from the panel, which might just be that I need this to get a grasp, but I think for the audience, I think this would be helpful, is if any one of you, I don't know if that falls to, it might be one for Maggie, it might be one for Elizabeth, just to say, what timetable do you expect to see for the big projects that you all want answers on, HS2, Transpennine route upgrade, and of course the whole Northern Powerhouse Rail project? You've got 3 massively expensive schemes there, and what I'm not really getting is any sense of the time frame and what it is to serve. So we've had mention of free ports. I'm not really picking up anything on which of those free ports are currently inadequately served, nor am I really hearing what the timetable is. Could either, I mean, whoever wants to pick that up, I think that would be helpful, because I'm just anxious. Otherwise, we're going to go into very precise, detailed questions, which there's plenty of time for. But I think we do need the bigger picture. Who'd like to pick that up? Yeah.
I'll have to have a go and then others can come in. In terms of which free port hasn't got the right capability for transporting freight in and out, the answer is all of them. From a rail point of view, none of the free ports in the north of England have got the right rail connectivity at the moment. Some are better than others, but overall they don't. And if I cast that net wider, even looking at some of the other ones further south, there are challenges on those routes as well. But there isn't that connectivity. In terms of timescales, the Transpennine route upgrade is so important because it is first. That development work is active. It is going for funding now, and the plans to date haven't properly dealt with freight. And that scheme is one that's going to be, you know, on the ground later this year and beyond, actually doing physical work. So we need to make sure we've got the right answer from that quickly. Now, Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2 are no less important, but their delivery timeframes are much further out. Post passenger recovery, a post TRU, we need to plan them right now, because this is, you know, the railways are going to see increasing demand from passengers and freight as, you know, as the economy recovers and decarbonisation progresses. But for me, it's about what are the short-term things we've got to be doing this year, next year, the year after, as well as the plans which take us down a longer term project profile in 10 to 20 years time.
Do you want to add anything on that, Elizabeth, or not? No?
No, but I was also thinking Lucy might have insight internally to the ones which are being promoted, but that's a really comprehensive answer from Maggie.
I've got a detailed question for Maggie, which is kind of relevant on that. We'll just have to try and duck and dive between the large and the smaller. We've got a question from Tony Plum, which says to all panelists, saying that the planned freight train provision on the Transpennine is only the existing 11 trains per hour. Basically, yeah. Who's putting up the argument that that isn't sufficient to network rail and DFT? Do you agree with that? What's the tell us what the issue is there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we are putting the pressure on, and we have been for half a decade now. I've got members of my team who are, you know, working every hour they work for me on this topic. We're in the working groups. We've been lobbying at every level, and Lucy's nodding because she hears from us, if not weekly, then, you know, then certainly fortnightly on the topic. You know, we've been making real progress, but we still don't have that commitment to having an hourly pass for freight with the right gauge for the containers that Stewart mentioned coming into ports like Immingham, Teesport and Liverpool across the Pennine and into those conurbations, and that's what we need.
Yeah, I think from a TFM...
What's the cost implication of that, though? What extra capacity are you looking for, and what's the cost, please? Any one of you.
So it depends what you assume about some other things, and that's why it's a complicated question. So without wanting to get into the tumbleweed of this, you know, to what's that interface between Northern Powerhouse and Transpennine? Are you going to do some work at the same time? There's also a question, I think, about how we use the capacity now. So is the passenger railway going to build back to where it was in 5 years, 2 years, 7 years? And could we run some freight not in the peak perhaps, but in the off-peak now, using some of that capacity, because that changes matters. There are some small bits of infrastructure that you might want to add if you're going to run more freight and more passenger. You might actually want to add some of that to get a reliable passenger service anyway. And there are 2 only tunnels where you might have to do some physical work to allow a container through.
Yeah, can I just come in on that a bit, Nicholas? We keep on about it, and Maggie keeps emphasising it quite rightly so, about, you know, the infrastructure that is needed for a lot of these products. And we've talked about the Freeport side of things, but if we want to make sure that the Freeports, you know, fulfil to their full potential, then we have to get this in, even on the minor roads. I mean, whilst in North East Lincolnshire, we have the ports are served very well by the M180 motorway, but it is the whole road network that we're looking at, including the last mile of any journey and the vital connections with that economic activity. That can only make a difference actually to whether the goods arrive on time. So we're looking, obviously we have got the support of Transport for the North on our ambitions, if you like, for what we're talking now, Great Grimsby Western Relief Road, which is going to be favourable, and that's going to give us that extra capacity to actually fulfil the ambitions for, you know, the whole of the Freeport status. We've got to make sure that the infrastructure is there, not on the major roads as well, but also on the minor roads that's affecting all of our lives. It's very important to their point.
Do you want to say something, Elizabeth, or not, or can I?
Well, I was just thinking it's almost the stars are aligned at the moment. So we have our Freeports initiative, we have our desire for improved connectivity. So Britain is really uncompetitive. We're about 29th in the world in terms of connectivity in our infrastructure, according to the World Bank for road, and I think maybe around the same for rail as well. We are wanting to increase our competitiveness after Brexit. We've also got issues with the franchising system at the moment, given the huge drop-off in demand after COVID. This is a time where everything is open for something substantial in terms of investment for projects that have been in years of development and discussion. And this is the year for pressing to get things delivered and get commitments.
Can I just come in as well? I think from a TfN perspective, we've repeatedly said, and we've repeatedly supported the arguments that Maggie's made and Elizabeth have made, and Councillor Swinburn on behalf of North East Links has made about the Trans-Pennine route upgrade being a very, very key part of the northern infrastructure. When you look at the Northern Powerhouse Rail developments, they're key to not only to speeding up journeys across the north if we deliver the new lines, but they're also that release capacity where that is available. It will offer enhancements for the freight industry as well. Now you've got to be careful and make sure that the access points are where the trains join and then leave the classic network. We need to make sure those pinch points are still free flowing, and that's part of the research that we're doing at the moment to double check what's going on the network. When you think that in 2008 the West Coast upgrade was absolutely scuppered because the people looking at the project hadn't fully considered the needs of the freight industry. We need to definitely make sure that the research that we do and the analysis that we do, both from a technical perspective and people looking at train plans and maps and goodness knows what, to liaising with the industry as well, to make sure that everything is taken account of, so we don't fall foul of that mistake as well. So that's something that's really sort of pertinent in my mind and TfN's mind as well, to make sure that what our plans are really solid and strong and can benefit both passengers and freight at the same time.
Thank you. I've got a whole load of questions which are brewing up about essentially asking to make the argument between investment in rail versus road. I should also say to the moderators, I can see a couple of grumbles saying, can you make the questions visible to everybody so there isn't duplication? So that, I don't know if that can be done at all or not. But essentially the question, I'd probably best batch them together, because otherwise we're going to get a bit lost here. But essentially, you know, here's one, for instance. Drew the Elder, Climate Change Committee in the 6th carbon budget says talking about modal shift of freight to rail. It could aid decarbonisation of the freight sector, but in the longer term, we expect zero emissions HGVs. And so then the question is, what assistance will we give to HGV hauliers to move over to hydrogen and eHGV? There's one, I must say, from the stuff I hear, in the pure rail industry, there's lots of talk about the way they seem to be losing the argument, because you've actually got new lines like East West Railway, which are not even going to be electrified. There's another one in that sort of area, which is here, white paper, same person, white paper published in 2020 on e-highways, estimated a budget. Sorry, this is basically lobbying for, it says a test section on the M58, but there's also talk here of the relative costs of HS2 versus roads. Whoever feels they're best placed to say that, how is the argument shifting between road and rail at the moment, whether on decarbonisation or simply on volumes? I know there are many strands to come in here. Who wants to fire off first? Elizabeth, perhaps, yeah?
Yeah, so we're a multimodal trade organisation. So we have working councils in rail, in air, in water, and then in road. There are more members for road because road has more journeys and so on in terms of our breakdown. But we often have these discussions, and in fact the conflict is very little indeed, because we want an optimised system. So it's not about fighting at the edges, it's about making sure each mode has a particular function. And there'll be a minister from a little while ago who Maggie may smile when they remember, and all they talked about was moving lobsters from Cornwall by freight trains. And each mode really needs to be optimized and do what it does well, and we don't need to be constraining. There's going to be new modes all the time. We've got our e-cargo bikes, we've got drones, we've got big drones, we've got small drones, and just to think in terms of what a particular mode does will constrain us from reaching a point of better efficiency. So I don't think we need to be having those trade-off. We can come together with our business cases, the valuation of freight versus passengers versus road versus freight. That's why we have economic cost benefit systems. We should be able to have rational discussions about those and seek to optimise all.
I think, well, we have to remember it's a private sector business here. So, I get really frustrated when I hear these arguments that say, okay, well, come on, rail freight, do all the heavy lifting now because you're low carbon, but would you mind very much closing your businesses down in 30 years because all the trucks will be battery by then? We're not going to invest in you now because we don't want you in the long term. You can't get people to invest in a business if there isn't a long-term proposition for it. And ultimately, this comes down to government choices about where it spends its money. And you're right that at the moment, the strategy, I think, for decarbonisation is we want to decarbonise the economy, but we don't actually want to spend any money on it. And that's what we get all the time, I think, that pushback. And that has to change, because if, for example, we could power up a battery HGV to replace the entire HGV fleet for 2050, and I think, as Elizabeth alludes to, there's lots of questions about all of this, then government still has to invest in charging networks, and it probably has to invest in the grid in a different way. And it might have to put overhead wires on the motorway network, because that's some of the current thinking about road decarbonisation. So there isn't, I don't think, a free good. What we've got to do is try and work out the most energy efficient and quick acting way of leveraging that decarbonisation. And that has to be about every mode doing something. There isn't going to be a let's switch off one mode and use another mode solution to this. We've all got to work together to do the most efficient thing. If you want to move 100 miles with 50 containers and do it electrically, use a train. If you want to use an e-cargo van into a city centre, make it battery. If you want to put a lobster on a train, even do it. But there isn't a single mode solution to this.
Thank you. On one thing you said, the government wants to decarbonise but doesn't want to spend the money. Just spell that out if you would, because in the area of the car business, we've had a couple of very big things, one of which is the announcement that we're not going to have pure ICE motors being sold beyond 2030, which is only, what, 8 years, 9 months away. And also from Monday, we're going to have clean air zones affecting about 8 to 10 million people by the end of the year, who will be paying simply to travel around towns and cities if their car is from before a particular date. So are you saying that decision simply being ducked for the railways, and what would be the equivalent for the ones which we've seen in the motor trade, which have had massive effects, which is why Tesla is the most valuable car company in the world?
Yeah, so there's a question about incentives, and it is entirely sensible to use incentives to cause people to change what they do in the situation where the thing that you wish them to do is doable in the time frame that the incentive applies. So that's cool. If there's something out there which is available or close to technology available and you want to use an incentive to drive it over the edge into viability, those financial tipping points are great. So today you could, you know, if we want to use electric on the network or diesel on the network, it's the same access charge, you know, so you might say, well, you could do something around the margins on that. But actually, if you're in a situation where the technology simply doesn't exist, you can't incentivize the laws of physics. That's what we're about here. The laws of physics say that the amount of battery or hydrogen you need to move a freight train that is 1/2 a mile long simply doesn't exist in the scale that you can build it. And it's the same with HGVs. You know, there are prototype battery HGVs, but the laws of physics mean that you're carrying more payload in battery than you're carrying in goods. It's not, you know, it's not yet the point. So at some point you'll reach a technological state where those incentives work and you can set that deadline. But if it doesn't exist, you can't do that.
Anybody else on that? Or Stuart, or shall I move on to another thing?
Can I just have a couple of points on that, if you don't mind, Nicholas? I think it's absolutely right what Maggie's been saying and what Elizabeth's saying. I fully agree with them. But I think you've got to support, you know, especially where we are in the Port of Immingham, I think we've got to support both rail and road for the sort of thing that we're talking about. I think we all know really, Nicholas, what the national targets are for decarbonisation. And I'm sure that those targets will be taken an advantage of what North East Lincolnshire has to offer when it actually comes to the success of the offshore, the wind industry, the maintenance side of things. Very, very big things happening down here in North East Lincolnshire with those particular ports. We've got the training facilities now with the catch development, very big for us, and the capacity for power generation for freight vehicles. And we're talking about freight now. We've got to get towards these decarbonisation targets and the infrastructure, and we are locally actually developing infrastructure to charge electric vehicles through our local transport plan. So yeah, we are working very well towards that, and it's a big thing that we've got to do. But it all links, doesn't it? It links to what we've been talking about before, infrastructure. You've got to have that infrastructure in place to help you to, you know, move forward. And that's a big thing. But we have got the availability, we've got the means of doing it. So we've got to, you know, unite and work together for it.
Yeah. Can I just come in as well? I think from a TfM perspective and also from other subnational transport bodies that are active, part of what we do is generate evidence and work out sort of what patterns are being observed around journeys and stuff. So other STBs are looking at sort of the van journey pattern. So where you have a concentration of vans in one area doing shorter journeys, they're probably going to be doing deliveries. And then you could have other vans doing things like longer journeys that are say 2 or 3 miles long, and then they stop because they're plumbers or they're electricians or they're doing a bigger job in a different place. So there's some emerging work on mapping the shorter journeys and the longer journeys to see where those hotspots are, so you can plan the recharging infrastructure, and you can kind of identify where those places need to be. So like I know in Grimsby there's charging points in the town centre. So in other places you can place points where those vehicles and those points are needed. So I think it's not only is it getting the policy right, so when Maggie talks about making sure that there's, and Elizabeth talked about the certainty around from government, which horse are we actually going to back here, what infrastructure do we need, but there's also a role for making sure that analysis reflects what is needed. And I've got my window open, I'm sorry, I think schools have just kicked out and it's very noisy and it's colourful as well, so I'm hoping that you can't hear what's going on behind me. But that's my point.
I've just turned my volume up to catch any surely well. So we've got a nice concrete question here from, it's to do with distribution warehouses, Amazon and the rest. We at Northumbria University been doing some spatial modelling. The long and the short of it is they reckon they've discovered that as well as the so-called golden triangle of East and West Midlands, there's a northern dumbbell emerging. And it says, pursuing a dual hub model. And the northern dumbbell, I don't know if that'll catch on, but we'll see, can reach as large a proportion of the GB population as the Golden Triangle. Are any of you aware of this? And is it factored in to the TfN freight and distribution strategy? So what's the answer to that?
I've heard this sort of pattern of what that question describes, and use many different and very different names for it. But I think overall, when you look at if you go back to the enhanced freight and logistics analysis that we published as part of the evidence base that fed into our strategic transport plan, we definitely looked at the patterns of imports and exports, and where larger volumes of goods started there, so the originated, so started and then got to their destinations. So I think yes, we have considered that, but I think the interesting bit is to make sure that not only do we know the patterns of trade and where the volumes go, but it's where those gaps, so where the gaps are as well. So if you think there's you need additional capacity to join those areas up, then we have to make sure that's in the plan as well. And that's part of what we're doing with the existing work alongside Atkins. They're looking at the impact of the infrastructure that is being planned, but also that we've already got, so we can make sure those corridors are as efficient and as effective as possible, and those are reliable, so you can make sure that all those connections are stable, and we don't affect them going into the future.
I'd love to know where this dumbbell was, by the way. If the person who submitted that, it'd be great to have some actual locations. While we're doing that, unless somebody else wants to publish, I want to jump on something Elizabeth said earlier, so we don't forget this, which is, you were saying something about bigger and longer trucks, and that we shouldn't allow public hostility to prevent that. Can you tell us what you mean? What tonnage are we talking? I'm aware of one particular trial at the moment, but what tonnage, what sort of roads, and what sort of impact are we talking?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I have in mind. One, we have something that's called Big Can Be Good. And I don't know if you remember, there was quite a famous poster, which is one of pictures paints 1,000 words. And you had a bus, a nicely utilised bus, and the numbers of cars that would have been in the road and how much space those would have taken up if people were driving and not on the bus. So that got me thinking. At the time, we had a minister who was so keen on e-cargo bikes, almost wrote a whole white paper about these were the future of transport. And one medium-sized lorry carries 10 tonnes and takes up this amount of space. If you were to put that into a van, it would be 10 vans. And if not, it will be 100 e-cargo bikes. But yet in our city centres, the first thing we do for our decarbonisation, we love to ban the lorry. One of the first things, we just somehow think of them as being bad and should be banned, whereas in fact, banning them could lead to the wrong consequences in terms of congestion. And we know how important congestion is in our bigger view and desire to decarbonise. So that's one area of it. Another area is when we think of rail, they're larger. But at the moment we've had, the other example is the longer semi-trailers. So that's been in place now for 6 years. We're always about to have an announcement on it. We're about to have another announcement on it, and have been consulted on whether regulation around it is required. But over the past 6 years, having 0.5% of UK HGVs 12% longer, it saved an approximate 28,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions, 270,000 fewer HGV journeys on the road, 70,000 fewer collisions, 32.9 thousand million kilometres. So we should be looking at the size of things, but in a bit more of an open-minded way, I think. And one of, as Logistics UK, we also want to make sure that that is not a challenge to rail. Rail is important. So it's not about challenging rail at the margins. It's about looking where there is a proper case for bigger vehicles.
One quick fight back to you, Elizabeth. I've got a short, sharp comment question here. The roads are in a very poor state already. If we had any bigger trucks, who will address the additional impact they'll have? That's a fair question, isn't it?
Yes, that had been looked at part of the study, and was not seemed to be too much of a problem.
Are you being serious?
I think they're also...
Everything I see in real life, plus the reports, is the roads are in absolutely shocking state, but there we go.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying the roads are in good condition at the moment, but in terms of our decision about longer semi-trailers, they are separate decisions. No, we are always very keen for road maintenance, because it again impacts on congestion, costs of running, all sorts of reasons. So it wasn't that I was talking about.
Can I throw to whoever's best equipped for this? There's something follow-up on that when you're having a pop at e-cargo bikes. What I would like to know is, instead of just hearing that something is a bad idea, I'd like to know if there's any view from any of you about how we can recalibrate and switch particular journeys. Because, for instance, we had a question here earlier on, have not heard anything about there being at least one freight terminal within each city or town with electric final distribution. And secondly, how can less than full train loaded consignments be accepted onto the rail, perhaps at night, so running with just a couple of carriages? But have any of you, do you know of any trials? Have you seen any proper work on saying, well, so okay, if the answer isn't to replace the bigger trucks, where can the efficiencies be made? Because surely the point of what I understand anyway about e-cargo bikes is they're often replacing vans for the last mile. When you see a big white van going around, and actually all it's delivering is a small item which could have gone much more efficiently. So what I'm interested, where is the potential for greater efficiency?
Can I come in on that, if you don't mind, Nicholas? Sure. You know, on the e-bike side of things, I mean, we're just embarking on quite a good program actually on about e-bikes rather than e-scooters. I'm not a fan of e-scooters, but e-bikes I think is very acceptable in our locations and our town centres and helping us to deliver the goods that's needed. So it's a big thing for us on that. Just on when you were talking previously about the highways and the state of the roads, a lot of the roads are in quite a poor state, and we've been fighting with our local MP, Martin Vickers, for the last few years about getting the A180, M180 resurfaced, and we was planned by Highways, or promised by Highways England, that would be done at a cost of £60 million. But now it's only just been announced today that that's not likely to get done now until the start of 2024, 2025 at a cost of £74 million. So it goes back to that, what I've been saying about having the correct infrastructure in place and making sure that we are suitable for today's age of technology, if you like, of the transport links for the road highways. So these sort of things need to be looked at by the ministers when they're assessing what roads need doing. And I'm surely now with the Freeport status, we would come top. You'd think we'd be needing to get our roads, you know, correctly maintained to make sure they're acceptable for the freight that's going to be using them.
I think, if I could come in as well, I think in terms of e-cargo bikes, what I've observed in other cities that have got e-cargo networks, so places like Rotterdam and Amsterdam, you look at the way they design their roads. I mean, this is not a TFN thing, because we took a look at sort of connecting important economic centres city to city and sort of wider considerations. But when you look at the way that those networks are planned, you've got specific lanes for the volume of bikes and the volume of other smaller vehicles on that infrastructure. That is all planned in. So 25 years ago, when they were putting the and redesigning roads and roadways, you had all the space planned in for those vehicles. That helps it to work, because you then have a free flowing network for both road vehicles like lorries and your vans and your cars, but also you've got the appropriate infrastructure there for your bikes and your e-cargo activity as well. And I think that level of planning, when you think about that accessibility on the road for both the pedestrian, the car user, and also the cyclist, is really important. It does take a bit of re-education. When you're walking around Rotterdam, you might get knocked over by a bike because they are very quiet, and if you're not aware of that, it's a big thing. But I think it is something to consider, the fact that these are good ideas, but they need to be planned into the infrastructure in our towns and cities to make them work effectively.
And just coming in on planning, because last year we had a planning white paper put out by the government, and it didn't mention one time in 80 odd pages industrial land, transport land, logistics land. It didn't mention anything, in fact, apart from house building. And what, e-cargo bikes are not my thing. I'm a rail professional, but if you want to have e-cargo bike, you've got to have warehousing closer into the city centres. Otherwise, if you're trying to serve the centre of Manchester, but your warehouses are all at Bolton, that isn't going to work for an e-cargo bike. So we have to think differently about the distribution of land in cities and how we use land to enable smaller, shorter journeys to be done in that way. And we're not even on the page on that, if the planning white paper didn't mention it once. But I think the original question did mention rail, and let me just put a couple of bits in that. We are already distributing some parcels on passenger trains, and the business that do that have just this week announced a big expansion of their network onto the cross-country trains network, so southwest to Scotland via all the obvious places. That's moving particularly medical supplies at the moment, although they do a whole host of other things. And we also have a member who's launching their first service in April from the West Midlands to Scotland on the west coast, with a converted passenger train that will be available for parcels or smaller roll-caged products. That's the first service there, but they're looking at a network of those. So there are some things coming to try and use that. Network Rail are auditing all their stations at the moment to see what it would take to have more of that in their estate as well. So some real positive developments in that particular area.
So if I'm just following that, is that a belief that actually we won't return to the levels of passenger demand that we had pre-pandemic, and that's a long-term shift? Yeah.
Well, it's not my place necessarily to talk about how passengers will or won't behave. I've got my personal view, which is as soon as I'm allowed out this house, I'm on a train and I'm gone. And, I'm sure there are plenty of others with similar mindset. But actually, I think there's a core premise here. And, there's some questions about it. It said you won't get freight because of passenger. And actually, at what point did somebody say that the railway was only for passengers? Why should we be in a situation where we're only allowed to run freight if there aren't that many passengers? Is the question we have to ask, is to what extent is moving freight vital for the economy? We wouldn't go out there and say, well, actually, we shouldn't have any lorries on the motorway because it's for private cars. I mean, the motorways have got their own problems with congestion and such like, but the concept that we would build a road and say, oh, it's only for cars, we just wouldn't do that. And we're in danger with the railway narrative of kind of doing that, of saying it's a passenger railway, and aren't you lucky, pat on the head, we let you on for a few services every night. And we have to reprogram that if we're going to have efficient, sustainable distribution, unlock free ports, unlock the economy. So yes, I think there's an opportunity. I think we can rebalance what we do. One train an hour isn't that much, but it shifts a lot of freight, so we're not asking for the earth here. There's an opportunity, I think.
And is that, I should chuck in one bit of information, the on the dumbbell, which is kind of relevant. I've just been, there's a message flashed up. If you've all seen it, forgive me, but basically saying it's either side of the Pennines along the M62 axis. But can you give some pointers? You're talking about maybe freeing up one train an hour, or whatever it might be for freight. Are you talking about something like that? Are you talking about the big, you know, the big warehouse distribution hubs? What type of business? What is actually going to be? What type of freight are we talking about here?
So there are different sorts of freight. So the real suppressed demand at the moment from Teesport and Immingham is for container traffic, and that needs to go into a suitable terminal. At the moment, that is Trafford Park in Manchester, or Widnes, or Garston at Liverpool. But there are others which are at the planning stage. You know, developers looking at additional sites for that kind of traffic. And what we have seen in the Midlands is that if you put the warehousing on a site that has got a railhead, and the obvious one in the TfN world is iPort at Doncaster, if you put warehousing on a site with a railhead, that gives those occupiers the opportunity to use rail. And if you put that warehousing on a site that doesn't, well, then they can't. And so that's how we have, you know, 12 trains a day coming out from Daventry, and phase 3 being built there. As we speak, we have 6 or 7 trains a day into iPort at Doncaster. We have, you know, 12 trains a day still going into Trafford Park. So not all rail, not all warehousing can be rail connected, but where it is, it's working.
So when I see for massive new warehouses being constructed along the motorway at Doncaster, for instance, should I be worried about that, or is there actually no alternative? Is that a short-sighted decision, in short? Well, or could it be picked up by rail?
Look, I mean, rail today takes 10% of surface transport, and you know, if we pedal really hard, we'll get into the teens and maybe up to 20, but there's still going to be a lot of road-based distribution, and not all warehouses are the same. Some are doing a very local hinterland of distribution, some are a national distribution centre, some are a regional big hub. But if you want rail to work, you need scale. So you need people to be putting their goods onto a train to make the train full. That works where you put those warehouses on a railing site. So where we can do that, it's great. Obviously, there'll be places where that isn't possible, but having some more rail link warehousing across the north of England is going to be really important, I think. Okay,
thank you. Just so that the people have had their shout, there's a comment here basically saying, which is aimed, I think Elizabeth saying, essentially, getting big trucks into city centres doesn't mix well with active travel, which is being prioritised. I don't know if you want to pop back on that, and I'll just mention a couple of other things before we have to wrap up. What do you say to that?
So yes, there's clearly issues with large HGVs and cyclists, and we are very, very committed to road safety. What I don't want to happen is we start banning the large trucks and replacing them by lots and lots of vans or lots and lots of smaller mode transports, which in fact end up in totality being less space, taking up less space or causing more congestion. So we do have to think very carefully, particularly a well-loaded lorry.
Okay. There's one last question I'll read out, and then I'm going to do sort of see if you can come up with I'm going to put you on the spot to summarise something. So it's quite a specific question. When will TfN be looking to approach suppliers with regards to tender, bidding or procurement of the stuff we've been talking about today? Am I allowed to read out a commercial? Amy Consulting and Rail are keen to support these initiatives.
So how our procurement system works is we've got basically a framework of people who we can approach for different strands of activity. It's quite a standard public sector way of working. So I'd encourage the questioner to sort of contact TfN, and we can put them in touch with the procurement team who can explain how that works, and then you go on a list and then you can bid for different elements of that work. I think most public sector organisations would recognise that as an approach, which is, it's just how it works. So we talk to all the suppliers, and as we go through procurement activity, and that's how it would work for Amy as well.
Thank you. Time's flown, so we're rushing towards the end. So I thought I'd try and get our money's worth out of our panelists. And I'd ask two different questions. One, where it's now spring 21. We know what's going to happen in the south. We know when HS2 is due in Birmingham. Can you please tell me which of the big projects that we've all heard about will have been built by 2030? So 200 years after the thing I started with, which is Liverpool-Manchester Railway, which of the new projects will have been built? And I've got a kicker question for each one of you as well, which is the Prime Minister appears to remain keen on a tunnel to Northern Ireland. How high a priority do you think that should be? I'm going to start, let's do it in the order in which people spoke. So the first question, what will we actually have, which is new by the end of the decade? Secondly, how high priority should the Boris tunnel be? Stewart Swinburn, please.
Thanks, Nicholas. I wish I knew. I wish I had that crystal ball that everybody would like, and we would know what is going to be happening. The thing for me, I would obviously like to see HS2, but I'd also like to see HS2 with that connectivity to North East Lincolnshire and that way on, so that we can, capitalise on what we've been talking about today. And I'm sure that all the recently announced government funding that's been announced just recently, I'm hoping that with the TFN's help that we can look forward to these sort of things to help create the transport to the capacity required for growth. It is all about growth at the moment. And so I'm looking forward to HS2, and hopefully it will come this way around where we're going to be able to take part of it and link in with the Freeport status.
And the tunnel?
No.
Big supporter?
No, I'm not actually. I'm not a supporter of that, and I don't think it's a viable option because of the money that we're talking about being spent on HS2. I don't think we can afford to spend that type of money on a tunnel as well. So I'm not in favour of that at the moment.
Maggie, what's where are we going to be?
Well, like Stuart, I'm no crystal ball gazer. The scheme I would like to see finished is the Transpennine route upgrade. What I do think we'll see finished is private sector investment in those free ports, in those terminals. The private sector is getting on with this, and it just needs government to step up and match. There is no commercial rail freight in Northern Ireland, so having a tunnel is of virtually no purpose to us whatsoever.
Okay. Elizabeth?
So
Your piece of wisdom, please.
We'd love to see Transpennine Road and Rail delivered. And if it's not finished by then, it needs to be on its way. They're the priority projects. And our response to the Union Connectivity Review did not put forward a tunnel to Northern Ireland. We discussed a bridge and said that would be a waste of time and money. I can't imagine that our views on a tunnel are much different.
Okay. Lucy, do you want to wrap up?
I think the key thing I'd like to see, like colleagues, is the Transpennine route upgrade for freight. Definitely, I think that's what I think you could get more than 10,000 vehicles a week off the M62 and on that east-west connectivity if you deliver that, which I think is really powerful. I also think that, and I share the views of the panel about the bridge to Northern Ireland in the tunnel. So yeah.
Well, I think that brings us, unless the organisers want to say something, I think that brings us to the end because we're given an hour.
Yeah.
And it's all very interesting, but I think it also it's slightly it's probably worth having this reality check then of all the more ambitious projects where truthfully the panelists actually think we're going to be at the end of the decade, where, as I say, compared to other walks of life, we're going to be, by then, if you're going to buy a car, it's going to be an electric one. So it could be that the freight business is doing a bit of catching up. But thanks for joining us, and that's over and out.